Are you questioning me or your own prejudice? Michelle Obama stood firm, her presence alone demanding respect. Yet Todd's scrutiny lingered, his doubt clear despite the luxury bracelet on her wrist. A mark of VIP access. Around them, guests whispered, sensing the tension. A moment later, the doors swung open. Barack Obama strode in, his presence electrifying. His eyes met Michelle's, a silent understanding passing between them. Then he turned to Todd. "Is there a problem?" Barack's voice was calm, but his authority was unmistakable. Todd's face paled, realization dawning too late. Silverfant, lady wasn't just a guest, she was history. What would you do if someone questioned your right to be where you belong? Tell us in the comments, subscribe, and drop your location below. The sun shimmered over the turquoise waters, its light reflecting off the expansive windows of the resort's beachfront lounge. A haven of opulence, the property boasted sprawling pools surrounded by palm trees, staff dressed impeccably, in tailored uniforms and gardens so pristine they looked painted. Inside the VIP lounge, the atmosphere oozed exclusivity. Wealthy guests reclined in plush leather seats, their laughter low and measured as they sipped on expensive cocktails. Discreet servers moved quietly, ensuring no request went unanswered, while floor-to-ceiling windows framed panoramic views of the endless ocean. Every detail, from the ambient lighting to the subtle hum of classical music, was designed to evoke sophistication and privilege. Among this world of affluence, Michelle Obama entered, her presence effortless yet commanding. Dressed simply but with an elegance that reflected her character, she carried herself with quiet confidence. Her attire, understated compared to the extravagant designer outfits surrounding her, set her apart, but not in a way that diminished her. If anything, it highlighted her authenticity in a room layered with artifice. She sought nothing more than a peaceful moment to enjoy the view, perhaps read a book, and retreat from the prying eyes of the public. The lounge appeared calm, but subtle undertones rippled through the air. Quiet glances and nearly imperceptible gestures hinted at class and racial divides, unspoken but undeniably present. For Michelle, these undertones were all too familiar. Pockets of judgment disguised as civility, boundaries that tried to silently dictate who belonged. As Michelle made her way toward an empty seat near the window, she noticed a staff member standing at the edge of the room. Todd, a senior employee, surveyed the lounge with practiced precision, his posture rigid and his gaze sweeping over each guest. When his eyes landed on Michelle, they paused ever so briefly. There was no hostility, but his brows furrowed for a moment as though he were assessing something amiss. Quickly, his professional demeanor returned, but the slight narrowing of his gaze had not gone unnoticed. Michelle entered the VIP lounge with the poise of someone who had spent a lifetime under public scrutiny yet never let it define her. Though her name was globally recognized, she carried herself with a humility that sought no special treatment. Her attire, simple but refined, reflected her preference for blending in rather than standing out. She offered a polite smile to a guest who caught her eye in recognition but quickly turned away, understanding her desire for privacy. Her quiet strength was evident in her every step. She paused near the panoramic windows, taking a moment to admire the ocean view, the sunlight shimmering on the waves. To the casual observer, she seemed perfectly at ease. But beneath her composed exterior, her thoughts stirred. Spaces like this, exclusive, luxurious, were often filled with unspoken barriers for people like her. Michelle's mind drifted to other moments in her life when she had entered similar spaces and been met with skepticism. She thought of the subtle glances, the unspoken questions about whether she belonged, and the quiet but persistent weight of having to prove herself in rooms where assumptions often preceded introductions. It wasn't bitterness she felt, but a firm resolve that had grown over years of rising above such moments. She adjusted the strap of her bag, her gaze steady as she selected a seat by the window. Today was supposed to be a quiet afternoon, time to relax, reflect, and escape the pressures of public life. What she didn't expect, however, was that her mere presence would challenge the rigid perceptions of someone who had already decided she didn't belong. Todd took immense pride in his position as the senior staff member of the resort's prestigious VIP lounge. To him, this role wasn't just about hospitality. It was about preserving the exclusivity that the resort marketed to its wealthiest clientele. He saw himself as a gatekeeper, someone who ensured that only the right people enjoyed the privileges of this carefully curated space. His movements were precise, his demeanor polished, and his adherence to the lounge's unspoken hierarchy unwavering. When Michelle Obama entered, his eyes instinctively flicked toward her. Though his face remained composed, his thoughts betrayed him. Michelle's casual yet elegant attire and her understated presence immediately caught his attention, not in admiration, but in skepticism. She didn't match the mental image he had of a typical VIP guest, the tailored suits, designer labels, or overt displays of wealth. To Todd, she stood out in a way that felt to him out of place. Maintaining his professional exterior, Todd approached her with what he thought was an inviting smile. "Good afternoon, ma'am. May I help you?" he asked, his voice laced with polite inquiry, but tinged with an unspoken question. "Do you really belong here?" Michelle, ever gracious, offered a warm response. She mentioned her room number and explained that she was here to enjoy the lounge as part of her accommodations. For a moment, Todd hesitated, his expression faltering slightly. "Are you sure you're in the right area?" he asked, his voice now carrying a faint trace of condescension. Though Michelle reassured him calmly, Todd's doubt didn't fade. He nodded curtly, his polite mask tightening, but his body language spoke volumes. His smile became forced, and the slight furrow of his brow betrayed his lingering disbelief. Todd's actions weren't overtly aggressive, yet they carried the weight of assumptions, small, calculated dismissals that he hid behind a professional demeanor. Each subtle microaggression, his tone, his skeptical gaze, his reluctance to accept her explanation, began to pile up, creating a quiet but undeniable tension that hung over the serene elegance of the lounge. For Todd, the VIP lounge wasn't just about rules. It was about enforcing his perception of who deserved to belong. And Michelle, despite her grace, challenged that perception in ways he couldn't fully articulate. As Todd's interaction with Michelle played out, the quiet elegance of the lounge began to shift, its serene atmosphere replaced with a growing undercurrent of unease. From behind the bar, Emma, a young staff member in her early 20s, observed the exchange closely. She admired Michelle's poise and the calm way she responded to Todd's increasingly curt tone, but Emma couldn't ignore the tension building in her chest. Todd's words were subtle, but their condescending edge was undeniable. Emma clenched her hands beneath the counter, debating whether she should step in. As a junior employee, she knew challenging Todd, a senior staff member, could have repercussions. Yet her conscience nagged at her. "This isn't right," she muttered under her breath, though her feet remained rooted in place. A few rows away, James, a businessman in his late 40s, adjusted his glasses and shifted in his seat. He'd recognized Michelle the moment she entered, and the way she carried herself only reinforced his respect for her. Watching Todd's dismissive behavior, James frowned deeply. He leaned back slightly, his mind racing as he considered his options. Should he step in and risk making the situation worse, or remain silent and let it play out? Around the room, other guests began noticing the tension, their curiosity piqued by Todd's unusually sharp tone. A woman sitting near the bar leaned toward her companion, her voice barely above a whisper. Why is he questioning her like that? She clearly doesn't deserve this, she said, her words tinged with indignation. Murmurs rippled through the lounge as heads turned discreetly toward the unfolding scene. People exchanged glances, their discomfort palpable, yet no one dared to speak up. The collective hesitation, the bystander effect, seemed to freeze the room in place. Each person felt the discomfort of what they were witnessing, but the unspoken rule of staying out of others' conflicts held them back. The room became charged with tension, each subtle shift in focus amplifying the weight of the moment. Emma's hand twitched toward the counter, and James sat on the edge of his seat, both torn between acting and staying silent. Meanwhile, Todd's interaction with Michelle continued, and the guests in the lounge, now fully aware of the simmering conflict, waited to see how it would unfold. Michelle had just reached her chair, ready to unwind, when Todd stepped forward with a calculated stride. His expression was tightly controlled, his professionalism masking the skepticism bubbling beneath the surface. "Excuse me, ma'am," he began, his voice polite but firm. "This area is reserved for VIP guests only. Are you certain you belong here?" Michelle looked up, meeting his gaze with a calm steadiness. Her voice was composed as she replied, "I'm staying in a suite." "Here." She added her room number, her tone leaving no room for doubt. "I was told the lounge was included with my accommodations." Todd's response was quick and cutting. "There must be some mistake," he said, the faintest smirk tugging at his lips. "I don't see how that could be possible." His words, though professional on the surface, carried an undercurrent of disbelief that wasn't lost on Michelle, or anyone else observing the exchange. Michelle felt the sting of his words, but she refused to let it show. She straightened slightly, her voice unwavering. "I assure you I'm in the right place," she said, her tone measured but firm. Todd, however, didn't relent. "I'll have to check with the front desk," he muttered, his voice now entirely dismissive. He turned away slightly, already assuming there was an error to correct. The energy in the lounge shifted palpably. Guests and staff alike could feel the quiet discomfort radiating from the exchange. Whispers rippled through the room, soft murmurs of unease that underscored the tension. Michelle remained composed, her resilience evident, even as Todd's behavior left no doubt about the bias underlying his professionalism. For her, this moment wasn't just about lounge rules, it was about perception and the unspoken assumptions that often accompanied it. Have you ever been judged unfairly because of how you look? How did you respond? Share your story below. Michelle sat with calm composure, her serene demeanor unwavering despite Todd's growing frustration. His polite mask began to slip as he stepped closer, his movements sharp and his tone clipped. "Ma'am," he said, lowering his voice as if to deliver a private reprimand. "It seems there's been a misunderstanding. This area is for VIP guests, and I don't think you—" He paused deliberately, his gaze scanning her attire. "Belong here." Michelle looked up, meeting his eyes steadily. Her voice remained even. "I'm confident I'm in the right place," she replied, repeating her room number with clarity. Todd's lips tightened as if her calmness irritated him further. "I'll need to verify this with the front desk," he said curtly, his tone dismissive as he turned away, leaving her seated while he walked off briskly. The exchange had not gone unnoticed. Guests seated nearby exchanged uneasy glances, their conversations pausing as the tension in the room began to grow. A man seated near the window muttered to himself, "What's his problem? She's clearly not causing trouble." Another guest, a woman holding a glass of wine, frowned deeply and leaned toward her companion. "This feels unnecessary," she whispered. When Todd returned, he wasn't carrying a resolution, he carried hostility. "There's no record of someone by your name as a VIP guest," he announced loudly, his words drawing more attention from those seated around the room. His tone, no longer masked by feigned politeness, sounded accusatory. "I'll have to ask you to leave the lounge until this is resolved." Michelle took a steady breath, her posture unshaken despite the sting of his words. The room seemed to grow colder, the weight of Todd's declaration lingering in the air. All eyes were now on Michelle, who remained composed even as his blatant rudeness filled the room. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, murmuring among themselves, their unease palpable. While some questioned Todd's behavior in whispers, others stared, unsure of whether they should intervene. In contrast to Todd's escalating hostility, Michelle's quiet strength only became more pronounced. Her calmness stood in stark relief against his disrespect, her poise amplifying the contrast between them. This was no longer about lounge policies, it was about something much larger. As Todd's sharp words lingered in the air, Michelle took a deep breath. Internally, she felt a pang of hurt, but not surprise. This was a moment she had faced many times before, and one she knew she would likely encounter again. It was exhausting, but it was familiar. Her thoughts drifted to earlier moments in her life, each one a lesson in resilience. She remembered stepping into boardrooms, aware of the unspoken scrutiny that followed her, the unvoiced questions about whether she belonged. She recalled her days at Princeton and Harvard, where her intelligence was often second-guessed before she could prove it. These experiences, though painful, had strengthened her, teaching her to rise above assumptions and hold her head high in spaces that weren't always welcoming. Still, the sting of Todd's words lingered. It wasn't just his dismissive tone, it was the weight of his assumptions. To Todd, she wasn't a person of importance, someone whose presence demanded respect. Instead, he saw someone who, by his judgment, didn't fit into his rigid idea of who belonged in this exclusive space. Frustration bubbled beneath Michelle's calm exterior, but she pushed it aside. She remembered her mother's words, spoken in moments when life's injustices felt insurmountable. "You don't fight fire with fire. You show them who you are by staying true to yourself." Those words were a mantra for her, a steady reminder to choose composure over anger. As she sat there, Michelle knew this wasn't just about Todd. The entire room was watching, their gazes curious and unsure, as though waiting to see how she would respond. She was keenly aware that her actions carried meaning, not just for herself, but for anyone who had ever been questioned, doubted, or dismissed. Her resolve solidified. She would not let Todd's bias define the moment. Her calm demeanor was not only a shield but a quiet declaration. She belonged here, and no one's assumptions could diminish that truth. While the internal struggle was real, Michelle chose grace, understanding that her composure carried a weight that could shift the narrative, not just for her, but for anyone who had ever been underestimated. The air in the lounge grew heavier as Todd's tone sharpened with each exchange. What had begun as a polite inquiry had now morphed into something far more pointed, and the unease was palpable. Guests who had initially been lost in their conversations now found themselves distracted, their eyes flicking toward the scene unfolding before them. Near the bar, a woman leaned toward her partner, her voice low but filled with discomfort. "This feels wrong," she muttered, her gaze fixed on Todd. "Why is he acting like that?" Her partner nodded grimly, his lips pressed into a thin line as they both continued to watch. James, a businessman seated near the window, had been observing the situation quietly, but the escalating tension was making it impossible to stay silent. He adjusted his glasses, leaned forward, and cleared his throat loudly enough to command attention. Todd's head snapped toward him, annoyance flashing in his eyes. "Excuse me," James began, his voice calm but firm. "Is there an issue here?" Todd straightened, his expression tightening. "I'm just following protocol," he replied. To his words clipped as though the interruption itself were a personal affront. James raised an eyebrow, his gaze steady. "Protocol shouldn't include singling someone out based on assumptions." he said pointedly, casting a glance at Michelle. His words hung in the air, their weight unmistakable. Behind the bar, Emma, the young staff member, fidgeted nervously. She had been watching the interaction from the start, her discomfort growing with every sharp word from Todd. Emma had been trained to prioritize guest satisfaction, but stepping in now would mean challenging her superior, a risk she wasn't sure she was ready to take. She glanced toward Michelle, who, despite the tension, offered her a kind, understanding look. It was a brief, silent exchange, but it steadied Emma, pushing her closer to the edge of action. The murmurs around the lounge grew louder as more guests noticed what was happening. Some whispered indignantly, their expressions mirroring their disapproval of Todd's behavior. Others, however, avoided eye contact, unsure of whether to intervene or remain silent. The room was divided, half filled with silent outrage, the other half immobilized by hesitation. But one thing was clear. The tension was no longer just about Todd and Michelle. The moment had grown larger, charged with the energy of a collective discomfort that everyone in the lounge could feel. Michelle's experience in the lounge wasn't an isolated moment. It was part of a larger, deeply ingrained societal problem. Todd's actions, though personal in execution, were shaped by broader systems of bias and prejudice. His assumptions about who belonged in the VIP lounge weren't born in isolation. They were reflections of how society has historically defined spaces of privilege and who is deemed worthy of accessing them. The incident highlighted the insidious nature of microaggressions. Todd's behavior wasn't overtly hostile, yet it carried a sting that was undeniable. His questioning of Michelle's presence, his condescending tone, and his insistence on verification were subtle but potent reminders of how implicit a bias operates. These small acts, often dismissed as misunderstandings or mere mistakes, are part of a much larger pattern. They are the quiet, daily reinforcements of systemic racism, behavior so normalized that it frequently goes unnoticed or unchallenged. For Michelle, Todd's actions were painfully familiar. Over the years, she had encountered countless moments where her worth, her credentials, and even her presence were questioned. These weren't isolated instances of individual prejudice. They were symptomatic of a broader societal tendency to view people of color, particularly women, as exceptions in spaces of power and privilege. Her calm composure in the face of Todd's behavior wasn't just a testament to her resilience, it was a strategy she had perfected through years of navigating such moments. For individuals like Michelle, existing in spaces where their presence is often doubted means carrying the additional burden of proving they deserve to be there. It's an unspoken weight, a silent expectation to meet and exceed standards that others are not held to. In the lounge, the dynamics between Todd, Michelle, and the bystanders mirrored society's broader struggle with confronting prejudice. Todd's actions reflected the learned behavior of enforcing boundaries against perceived outsiders. The guests' hesitation to intervene spoke to the pervasive discomfort many feel when witnessing discrimination, unsure of whether or how to act. This moment wasn't just about Michelle. It was a microcosm of a larger systemic issue. It revealed how bias operates on multiple levels, from the individual to the institutional, and how difficult it can be to challenge these dynamics when they are so deeply woven into the fabric of everyday life. Yet, in her calm and unwavering presence, Michelle challenged those systems, forcing those around her to confront their own assumptions and biases. Todd's tone grew sharper, his frustration visible in his tightened jaw and clipped words. Yet Michelle sat firmly, her composure unshaken by his mounting hostility. "I've already explained that I'm staying here as a guest," she repeated, her voice calm but deliberate, her gaze unwavering. "If there's a misunderstanding, I suggest you verify it. Her tone was resolute, not confrontational, but it carried the weight of someone who had navigated moments like this countless times before. Todd paused briefly, visibly unsettled by her steady demeanor. He was used to his authority going unquestioned, but Michelle's calm refusal to back down disrupted his sense of control. The subtle shift in the room's energy was palpable. Guests who had been quietly observing from their seats began to take notice of Michelle's quiet strength. Her confidence, clear and unwavering, made it impossible for anyone to dismiss her lightly. A few exchanged nods or murmured in quiet approval, while others, who had hesitated earlier, now watched with a growing sense of admiration. Even Todd, momentarily thrown off, faltered as he attempted to reassert his authority. "Ma'am," he began, his words tinged with condescension, "I've been working here long enough to know when something's out of place." His tone suggested a self-assuredness that only underscored his assumptions. Michelle met his gaze, her expression unflinching, her voice, still steady, cut through the growing tension. "I assure you," she said, "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Her words, delivered without anger or defensiveness, were a clear declaration. She belonged in that space, and no one's assumptions or biases could undermine that truth. The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the soft rustle of movement as guests shifted in their seats. Todd stood stiffly, his frustration mounting, but the weight of the moment left him momentarily speechless. Michelle's poise was undeniable, her presence commanding respect even in the face of thinly veiled hostility. Her refusal to rise to his bait wasn't just a response to Todd. It was a message to everyone in the room. She didn't need to raise her voice to assert her place. Her grace, combined with her strength, spoke louder than any argument ever. Good Todd's frustration reached its peak, and the mask of professionalism he had maintained began to crumble. His words came out sharper, laced with exasperation and a prejudice he could no longer conceal. "Look," he said, his voice firm and impatient, "people like you don't typically have access to this lounge. Are you sure there isn't some mistake?" The room froze. The weight of his words seemed to hang in the air, amplifying the silence that followed. It was no longer just a matter of condescension, it was outright prejudice, laid bare for everyone to see. Those who had been watching quietly now sat stunned, their expressions reflecting a mix of disbelief and anger. Michelle, seated gracefully throughout the ordeal, felt the sting of his words like a sharp jab. For a brief moment her calm exterior faltered, her composure cracking under the weight of his blatant insult. She caught her breath, steadying herself, her face momentarily revealing the exhaustion that came from enduring years of assumptions and dismissals like this. But just as quickly, she composed herself again, her quiet strength returning to shield her from the venom in Todd's words. "Ada." Whispers in the lounge grew louder, now impossible to ignore. Guests exchanged incredulous glances, their murmurs breaking through the once silent tension. A woman seated nearby shook her head in disbelief. "Did he really just say that?" she muttered, her voice low but filled with indignation. James, seated near the window, could no longer contain himself. Rising from his seat, he fixed Todd with an incredulous glare. "Did you really just say that?" he asked, his voice cutting through the murmurs like a sharp blade. The anger in his tone mirrored what many in the room felt. "Do you even hear yourself?" Todd turned toward James, his expression defensive. "I'm just doing my job," he said, though his voice carried less confidence now, but James wasn't letting it go. "No," he replied firmly. "What you're doing is singling someone out because of your assumptions. That's not your job, it's your bias." The collective unease in the room began to transform into something stronger, disapproval, solidarity, and a shared acknowledgement that Todd had gone too far. Michelle remained seated, her calm demeanor now a quiet act of defiance against the prejudice that had been so clearly exposed. The tension in the lounge had reached a breaking point. Todd's final cutting remark had left the room in stunned silence, broken only by the low murmurs of disbelief and outrage rippling through the guests. Just as it seemed the moment couldn't grow more charged, the doors to the lounge swung open and in walked Barack Obama. His presence was magnetic, effortlessly commanding the room the moment he stepped inside. The murmurs grew louder as guests began to recognize him, their curiosity quickly giving way to astonishment. Conversations halted, heads turned, and an electric energy spread through the space as the reality of who had just entered began to sink in. Barack's sharp eyes scanned the room, immediately locking onto Michelle. His expression softened as he took in her composed demeanor amidst the swirling tension. With his signature ease, he walked across the room, his stride unhurried but deliberate. The power dynamic in the lounge shifted entirely in those few moments. Placing a reassuring hand on Michelle's shoulder, he leaned down slightly and asked, "Is everything all right here?" His voice was calm, warm even, but there was an authority in his tone that left no room for evasion. Todd visibly tensed. The confidence he had displayed earlier evaporated almost instantly. His shoulders stiffened and his face flushed with the realization of who was now standing before him. The boldness he had wielded so carelessly moments ago crumbled under the weight of Barack's quiet yet undeniable presence. The murmurs among the guests turned into hushed whispers. "It's him," someone said, barely audible. "Do you think—" "He heard what Todd said," another voice asked. The curiosity and disbelief in the room reached a fever pitch. Michelle looked up at her husband, her expression calm but touched with relief. "There seems to be some confusion about my presence here," she said lightly, her voice steady despite the emotional toll of the situation. Barack straightened, his gaze turning toward Todd. His smile remained, but there was a quiet intensity behind it. Without raising his voice, he had already taken control of the room. The balance of power had shifted entirely, and everyone, including Todd, could feel it. "Do you think Todd's actions reflect a deeper societal issue? How do we combat biases like these? Share your thoughts below." Barack stood tall, his commanding presence drawing every eye in the lounge. The room seemed to hold its collective breath, the weight of the moment palpable. His calm, piercing gaze settled on Todd, whose once confident demeanor faltered almost instantly. Without raising his voice, Barack spoke, each word deliberate and measured. "Excuse me," he began, his tone low but firm. "Can you explain why my wife was treated this way?" Todd, who had been so assertive moments earlier, now looked visibly uncomfortable. His posture stiffened as he attempted to maintain composure, but the crack in his confidence was unmistakable. "Sir, I was just following protocol," Todd stammered, his words shaky. He gestured vaguely toward the lounge policies. "We have certain standards to ensure our VIP guests are comfortable." Barack's expression didn't waver. He let the statement hang in the air for a moment before responding, his voice calm but carrying a quiet authority. "And what about her?" he asked. "Made you think she didn't meet those standards?" The room seemed to grow even quieter, the weight of the question cutting through the air like a blade. Todd faltered, glancing around as if searching for support, but the disapproving glances from guests offered him none. "It wasn't personal," Todd insisted weakly. I wasn't sure she was supposed to be here." Barack took a step closer, his tone sharp but still controlled. "It became personal the moment you singled her out," he said, his words deliberate. "My wife has faced assumptions like yours her entire life, and I assure you, she is more than qualified to be here. Your behavior doesn't reflect a misunderstanding. It reflects a bias, and that is unacceptable." Todd's face reddened, and he opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Barack's unwavering presence, combined with the clarity of his words, left no room for Todd's usual justifications. The lounge was utterly silent, the tension thick. Guests exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from shock to admiration. A woman whispered to her companion, "I can't believe he had the nerve to say that to her." Another guest nodded quietly, his gaze fixed on Barack with a mix of respect and awe. Emma, the younger staff member behind the bar, paused in her movements, her wide eyes fixed on the scene. She wiped her hands nervously on a towel, her admiration for how the situation was being handled evident. Barack's words didn't just address Todd, they reframed the moment, exposing the deeper issue at hand. What had begun as an uncomfortable but personal slight was now a powerful statement about confronting prejudice, even when it hides behind the guise of professionalism. The silence in the room spoke louder than words as Todd stood there, visibly shaken, facing the undeniable truth of his actions. Michelle, calm as ever, remained seated, her strength a quiet but unyielding force as Barack's words continued to echo through the space. Michelle stepped forward, her presence commanding yet graceful, and began to speak. Her voice was calm, but it carried a quiet, undeniable strength that immediately captivated the room. "This isn't just about one incident," she began, her words measured but powerful. "This is about how prejudice, whether subtle or overt, finds its way into our everyday lives. And it's about the choices we make when we see it happening." The room was silent, her words cutting through the lingering tension like a knife. Michelle's gaze shifted to Todd, steady and unyielding, but absent of malice. "You didn't question whether I belonged here because of any real evidence," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You questioned me because I didn't fit your idea of what someone in this space should look like." The weight of her words hung in the air, and Todd visibly squirmed, his earlier confidence now a distant memory. But Michelle wasn't finished. She turned her attention to the onlookers, her voice now addressing not just Todd, but everyone present. "And Todd isn't the only one who carries assumptions like these," she continued, her tone steady yet poignant. "These assumptions exist everywhere, in businesses, in schools, in workplaces. They're not about one person. They're about a system that teaches us, consciously or not, to judge people before we even know them." Her voice grew stronger, infused with emotion, as she allowed herself to share the gravity of her message. "It's easy to stay silent when we see something wrong," she said, her gaze sweeping the room. "It's easy to think it's not our place to intervene or that it's someone else's problem. But silence allows these moments to keep happening. And if we want change, real, lasting change, we have to start speaking up. We have to stand up for ourselves and for each other." Her words struck a chord, and the energy in the room shifted. Guests who had hesitated earlier now looked visibly moved, some nodding in agreement. Emma, standing behind the bar, wiped a tear from her cheek, her earlier nervousness now replaced with admiration. James, seated nearby, nodded quietly, his respect for Michelle clear on his face. Michelle's words didn't just point out the problem, they inspired hope for a solution. She made it clear that this moment was about more than her experience. It was about addressing a system that allowed biases to persist and challenging everyone in the room to do better. By the time she finished, the room felt transformed. Guests and staff alike seemed to sit a little taller, their expressions reflecting both the weight of her message and the hope it carried. Michelle had turned a moment of prejudice into an opportunity for reflection, growth, and change. Her grace and strength were a reminder that even the smallest moments of resistance could inspire something greater. Just as the tension in the lounge reached its peak, the resort manager arrived, his expression a mix of concern and determination. The weight of the situation was evident in his hurried steps as he made his way toward Michelle and Barack. Stopping just in front of them, he adjusted his posture. his voice carrying a tone of sincere apology. "Mr. and Mrs. Obama," he began, his words careful but resolute, "I am deeply sorry for what has occurred here today. This behavior is not only unacceptable, but also a failure on our part as an organization. I take full responsibility for addressing it." The entire room fell silent, all eyes now on the manager as he shifted his focus to Todd, who stood awkwardly nearby, his face pale and his confidence completely eroded. The manager's tone hardened, firm and unyielding as he addressed the staff member. "Todd, we have received multiple complaints about your conduct today. Your treatment of Mrs. Obama was not only unprofessional, but also a direct violation of our core values and the standards we hold ourselves to as an establishment." Todd began to stammer, the reality of his actions now hitting him like a tidal wave. "Sir, I didn't mean—" he started, but the manager cut him off with a sharp hand gesture, signaling that there was no room for debate. "Enough," the manager said sternly. "This is not up for discussion. Effective immediately, you are suspended pending further investigation. You are to collect your belongings and leave the premises." Todd's face drained of color, his earlier bravado completely shattered. He opened his mouth as if to protest again, but quickly realized there was no point. The manager's authority was unshakable, and the judgment had already been passed. Two security personnel quietly stepped forward to escort Todd out of the lounge, and as he walked away, head bowed, a quiet ripple of applause spread through the room. The acknowledgement of justice being served brought a sense of relief and resolution to the guests. Some clapped softly while others exchanged approving nods. The tension that had gripped the space began to dissipate, replaced by a collective understanding that the right action had been taken. Michelle, ever gracious, nodded politely at the manager's words, but refrained from celebrating Todd's removal. For her, this moment wasn't about punishment or vindication. It was about ensuring that the lesson was learned and that this situation would spark meaningful change. She sat with her usual calm dignity, her focus remaining on the broader implications of what had unfolded. The manager turned back to Michelle and Barack, his tone now formal but deeply apologetic. "I can't express enough how sorry I am," he said, his voice carrying genuine remorse. "Please know that we will be taking immediate steps to ensure this never happens again. This incident is unacceptable, and we will be reviewing our training and practices thoroughly." Barack nodded in acknowledgement, his expression reserved but firm. Michelle offered a small, understanding smile, her grace a reminder that the moment wasn't just about addressing the past, but paving the way for a better future. As the tension began to dissipate, the lounge settled into an unusual quiet. The earlier unease that had filled the room now gave way to a sense of reflection, as if everyone was collectively processing what had just unfolded. It was James, still seated near the window, who broke the silence. Adjusting his posture, he spoke with a measured tone, loud enough for those around him to hear. "You know, this isn't the first time I've seen something like this," he began, his voice carrying both regret and resolve. "I've kept quiet before, telling myself it wasn't my place to step in, but today reminded me that silence isn't the answer. If we don't speak up, nothing changes." His words resonated, and a few heads nodded in quiet agreement. The pause that followed was broken by Emma, the young staff member who had watched the entire situation unfold from behind the bar. She stepped forward hesitantly, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I wanted to say something earlier," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly, "but I was scared. Todd's my superior, and I didn't want to create conflict or put myself at risk." She paused, glancing toward Michelle, whose kind expression encouraged her to continue. "Seeing how you handled it, Mrs. Obama, makes me realize that speaking up matters even when it's hard. I need to do better next time." Emma's vulnerability sparked a ripple effect. One by one, other guests began to share their own stories. A woman in her 40s leaned forward in her chair, her voice laced with emotion. "I've been there," she said softly. "At work, I was overlooked for a promotion. They didn't say it outright, but I knew the reason. They didn't think someone like me could lead. It feels so lonely in the moment, like you're carrying the weight of it by yourself. But hearing you speak, Mrs. Obama, reminds me that we're not alone in this fight." Her words hung in the air, and the energy in the room shifted again, this time into something lighter, more hopeful. The lounge, once divided by hesitation and discomfort, transformed into a space of solidarity. Guests began exchanging stories, ideas, and reflections, inspired by Michelle's grace and courage in the face of prejudice. A man near the back, who had remained silent until now, spoke up. "This kind of thing happens more often than we realize. It's just that most of the time, people don't want to acknowledge it, or they think it's not their problem. But today felt different. It felt like something shifted. Staff members who had been standing quietly at the edges of the room now joined the conversations, their expressions thoughtful. The collective reflection on bias, responsibility, and courage was palpable, creating a sense of shared understanding and purpose. Michelle, listening quietly, smiled softly. The moment wasn't just about addressing what had happened. It was about fostering change. She had turned an instance of prejudice into a lesson in empathy, reminding everyone in the room that they could be part of the solution. Have you ever witnessed someone being held accountable for their actions? How did it make you feel? Share your story below. Within 24 hours of the incident, the resort released a formal public apology addressed directly to Michelle and Barack Obama. The letter, signed by the CEO, expressed deep regret for the disrespect Michelle endured and acknowledged the broader implications of what had transpired. "We are profoundly sorry for the unacceptable behavior displayed by one of our employees," the statement read. "This incident does not reflect our values or our commitment to ensuring all guests feel respected and welcomed. We failed in this moment, and for that, we take full responsibility." The apology didn't stop at words. The resort pledged to take immediate and concrete actions to ensure such an incident would not happen again. Among the steps announced were a comprehensive internal investigation into the incident, the implementation of mandatory diversity, equity, and inclusion (DEI) training for all staff, and regular evaluations of employee conduct. The resort also introduced an open-door policy for addressing concerns about bias or discrimination, aiming to create a safer and more inclusive environment for both staff and guests. While many praised the resort for addressing the issue quickly, others remained skeptical. Some questioned the sincerity of the apology, pointing out that public relations pressure often motivated such statements. Social media amplified the conversation, with the incident becoming a trending topic. Hashtags, such as bias in hospitality and accountability, now brought people together to share their thoughts and experiences. The resort's actions were dissected by the public and industry professionals alike, serving as a case study in how businesses should, or shouldn't, handle instances of bias responsibly. For Michelle, the apology was a necessary first step, but it wasn't the solution. Her focus wasn't on vindication, but on the precedent the incident set. It wasn't just about her. It was about what could be learned and implemented from the situation to ensure others wouldn't face the same treatment. "We all make mistakes," Michelle said in a brief statement following the apology. "But what matters is how we respond to them, how we learn from them, and how we use these moments to grow." Her words reminded everyone that meaningful change required more than promises. It demanded sustained action. For Michelle, this wasn't just about addressing the past, but building a better future. Days after the incident, Michelle Obama sat for a public interview, her demeanor calm but resolute. The studio was warmly lit, casting a glow that matched her empathetic tone as she recounted the events that had transpired. Her words carried the strength of someone who had faced adversity time and again, but they also brimmed with the wisdom of someone who knew how to turn those moments into opportunities for growth. "Moments like this are painful," she admitted, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "But they're also opportunities to educate, to reflect, and to grow. I've always believed that adversity can serve as a catalyst for change, but it's up to us to turn that pain into purpose." Michelle spoke candidly about the importance of confronting prejudice with grace, even when emotions run high. "It's easy to react with anger, and trust me, I felt it in that moment," she said, her gaze steady as she addressed the audience. "But I also knew that how I responded would set the tone, not just for me, but for everyone watching. It's about showing people the power of composure and the strength in standing firm without losing your sense of self." Her reflection wasn't just about her own experience. She turned her attention to others who might face similar challenges, offering encouragement and practical advice. "You don't have to accept being dismissed or disrespected," she said, her voice soft but resolute. "Speak up, but do it in a way that aligns with your values. Change starts with each of us, and our actions, no matter how small, can inspire others to do the same." Michelle's words struck a chord with audiences across the globe. Her ability to transform a personal slight into a teachable moment resonated deeply, igniting conversations about implicit bias, systemic prejudice, and the importance of grace in advocacy. Social media platforms buzzed with clips of her interview, where she emphasized the power of resilience and the necessity of addressing bias openly. People praised her ability to find purpose in pain, to use an unjust moment to inspire progress. For many, Michelle's words served as a reminder that grace and strength are not signs of weakness, but tools for creating lasting change. The incident, while difficult, became a symbol of how dignity and determination can shine a light on issues too often left in the shadows. Her reflection left a lasting impact, inspiring individuals and communities alike to confront prejudice with courage and compassion. Michelle's experience at the resort didn't end with her. It ignited a global movement, sparking conversations about implicit bias and systemic discrimination that reached far beyond the lounge. Social media platforms became a hub of reflection and solidarity, as people from all walks of life began sharing their own experiences under hashtags like #Stand with Michelle and End Discrimination. One tweet, which quickly went viral, captured the mood of the moment. Michelle Obama handled that situation with more grace than anyone should ever have to. How many of us have faced something similar but didn't have the platform to address it? Let's talk about this. Thousands of replies followed, each telling stories of exclusion, judgment, and microaggressions that individuals had endured in their workplaces, schools, and even everyday interactions. In classrooms, teachers incorporated the incident into their lessons, using it as a case study to illustrate how bias can manifest in subtle but harmful ways. Students engaged in thoughtful discussions about how assumptions shape perceptions and how they, as the next generation, could challenge those biases. Workplaces also took note. Inspired by Michelle's grace and composure, organizations hosted discussions on diversity, equity, and inclusion, aiming to create more inclusive environments. Leaders acknowledged that these moments, while often dismissed as isolated incidents, were symptoms of a much larger systemic issue that needed addressing. Activists, academics, and thought leaders seized the moment to amplify the conversation. Further, Articles dissected the resort incident, interviews highlighted the systemic roots of prejudice, and panel discussions offered actionable strategies for building more equitable spaces. The message was clear: bias isn't just a personal flaw, it's a societal issue that requires collective effort to dismantle. For those who had long felt invisible or dismissed, Michelle's story became a symbol of hope and empowerment. Her ability to transform a moment of injustice into a lesson of grace and resilience resonated deeply, reminding others that they weren't alone. It showed that even small acts of resistance, like standing firm, speaking calmly, or refusing to shrink, could ripple outward and inspire change on a larger scale. Michelle's experience became a rallying cry, not just for those who had endured similar challenges, but for allies seeking to better understand their role in addressing prejudice. The story proved that moments of adversity, when met with dignity and courage, could spark movements capable of pushing society toward progress. Her grace had become a catalyst for a global reckoning, proving the power of one voice to inspire millions. Following the widespread fallout from the incident, the resort wasted no time in announcing a series of sweeping reforms designed to address the underlying issues brought to light. At a well-attended press conference, the CEO of the resort stood before cameras, her demeanor resolute as she addressed the public. "This incident has been a wake-up call for us," she said candidly. "We recognize that creating a culture of respect and inclusion requires more than words. It requires meaningful, sustained action." The reforms, as outlined by the CEO, were comprehensive and aimed at tackling the root causes of bias within the organization. Among the most notable initiatives was the implementation of mandatory diversity, equity, and inclusion (DEI) training for all employees. These sessions were designed to address implicit biases, encourage empathy, and provide tools for staff to navigate situations with fairness and professionalism. Additionally, the resort established a dedicated accountability committee tasked with overseeing the resolution of incidents related to discrimination or bias. This committee would be composed of internal leaders and external equity experts, ensuring a balanced and impartial approach to handling complaints. To further promote transparency, the resort introduced new channels for guests and employees to report concerns confidentially, emphasizing that every report would be taken seriously and addressed swiftly. To deepen their commitment, the resort partnered with external organizations specializing in equity and inclusion. These partnerships aim to provide long-term guidance and expertise, helping the resort foster a workplace culture that prioritized respect and belonging. Guest feedback was also elevated, with surveys and forums created to encourage dialogue about bias and fairness within the resort experience. The changes were met with cautious optimism. Many praised the resort for taking responsibility and acknowledging its shortcomings. Social media users noted that while the initial incident had been disappointing, the resort's response demonstrated a willingness to learn and improve. However, others remained skeptical, voicing concerns that the reforms could be performative unless backed by measurable results. "Actions speak louder than promises," one comment read. "Let's see how this plays out in the long run." For Michelle and Barack, the reforms represented an encouraging step forward. In a follow-up statement, Michelle said, "It's not about perfection, it's about progress. We can't expect change overnight, but we can demand accountability and continuous improvement. This is how we move forward. One action, one step, one commitment at a time." The reforms signaled hope for a better future, a reminder that even the most difficult moments could lead to meaningful change when approached with accountability and purpose. The story concluded not in anger or bitterness, but with a resounding sense of hope. What began as a painful and unjust encounter had been transformed into a powerful testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the capacity for meaningful growth and change. In her final public remarks on the incident, Michelle reflected on the lessons she hoped others would take from it. "We can't always control how people treat us," she said, her voice steady and compassionate, "but we can control how we respond. Grace and resilience are more than just tools for getting through difficult moments. They're pathways to change. They're how we rise above." The impact of the incident rippled far beyond the resort lounge. What could have been dismissed as another moment of everyday prejudice instead sparked global conversations about equality, bias, and justice. Communities across the world were inspired to reflect on their own assumptions and the ways in which those biases influence interactions and systems. Organizations, prompted by the incident's visibility, began re-evaluating their own policies and cultures, taking steps to foster more inclusive environments. For those who had endured similar injustices, Michelle's calm but firm response became a symbol of strength and inspiration. Her ability to rise above the moment, to turn adversity into advocacy, reminded everyone watching that dignity and advocacy are not mutually exclusive. They can and must go hand in hand. The story closed with a reflection on the importance of collective action. As Michelle had often emphasized, change doesn't have to start with grand gestures. It begins small, with one conversation, one action, one person willing to speak out or stand up. But those small moments, when multiplied, have the potential to ripple outward, creating a more equitable and just society for everyone. The moment was no longer about a single incident of prejudice. It had become a call to action, a reminder that every step forward, no matter how small, matters. It was a testament to the power of turning pain into progress and adversity into opportunity. What steps do you think we can take to create a more inclusive society? Share your ideas in the comments and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that inspire change.